Hey, welcome everyone to some stops along the way, your podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of their history, culture, geopolitical context, etc. Glad you could join us. Our last episode, we traveled to the Kingdom of Bhutan, this small Buddhist kingdom nestled in between Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. And we're going to go back there today, but first we've got some business to do. First order of business is this sweatshirt. It says Svaneti, Georgia. So I want to do a shout out to my friends in the Svaneti region of the country of Georgia. Visited them many times while I was there. This is the Svaneti Freeride t-shirt. It's a ski event that our project promoted while I was there. Had the chance to go up to Messia and spend time with Capitan and the great group in Svaneti many times. So I just want to do a shout out to them. Also, this podcast is a companion to my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way. It's available on Amazon.com. If you have not got a copy yet, hope you'll jump on and do that. But the big news today, exciting news, is that my new novel has dropped. It's called Skagway. And it is based, as it sounds like, in Alaska. And if you like a wholesome story that is the nexus of family, adventure, a little bit of humor thrown in, and romance, you're going to like Skagway. It's available on Amazon.com right now. Just type in Skagway McCord. It'll take you to the site. Or you can jump on my Facebook and Instagram pages, and you can find the link there as well. And who knows, I may even put it in the comments of this podcast. But at any rate, hope you'll grab your copy of Skagway. It's just $10. It's an easy read. You're going to like it. And so I encourage you to jump on today and do that. All right, enough business. We're going to go back to Bhutan today. This profoundly interesting country that, as I told you, the first time I worked there, the king at that time, Jimmy Singhi Wangchuck, had not yet introduced internet and television to the country because he was waiting for the 25th anniversary of his coronation as king. I happened to be there on that date, and I saw the television come on in the country for the first time, and it was an amazing experience. And I talked about that during the last episode. But because it was so remote and at that time so disconnected with a lot of the rest of the world, it created a communications black hole. I mean, I could get Skype out at the UNDP office. People don't even use Skype anymore, but I was using Skype then. But it was very difficult even to get a line out to use Skype. And so John Atwill, who I talked about in the last episode, and I were a couple of the expats that were working there. There weren't that many of us. And we were all in the same situation, really, in a communications void almost. Most of the time, that was okay. You get used to it, to being disconnected from the rest of the world. But on one particular day, it created a big problem. I went down to breakfast at my hotel one morning, and John and I usually would have breakfast together, and he said, "Mark, look, I managed to get out a call to my wife on Skype, and you live in Colorado, right?" And at that time I did. I lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And he said, "Look, man, I don't want to put a black cloud over your day, but my wife said there's been a very terrible school shooting in Colorado." And I said, "Where?" And he said, "I don't know where." Well, at that time, Debbie was a technology manager for a middle school in Colorado Springs, and Daniel went to that school. So I said, "Do you even know what city?" He said, "I don't know what city. I don't know anything." other than there's been a school shooting in Colorado and there are a lot of fatalities. Well, of course, this was really weighing on me because I had to find out what was going on. And so I spent much of that day trying to get a line out so that to communicate on Skype or get an email out at the UNDP office to try to find out what was going on. And it was nearly 6 p.m. my time in Bhutan before I was able to reach Debbie and find out that school shooting did not affect her and Daniel, although it affected the lives of countless others. Of course, that was Columbine. And that was the one day that I felt not only disconnected, but I felt just helpless because there was literally nothing I could do. There was no way to, it's not like you could easily fly out of the country. You couldn't easily communicate. I mean, now, anywhere I am in the world with a sat phone, I can find out, and internet, I can find out just about anything at any time. Not so then, because of the communications network in the country. So you might ask, that sounds really backward. I mean, this was the late 1990s. How could there be a country that didn't have television and didn't have internet, and where it was so difficult to communicate with the outside world? Were they really that backward? And the answer to that question is no, they really weren't that backward. As a matter of fact, one could argue that they were visionary. In the last episode, I talked about this concept in Bhutan called gross national happiness. This was a concept that was not created by him, but promulgated by King Jimmy Singhi Wangchuck. And when I first got to Bhutan, people would mention it, and we thought it was cool, and we laughed about it, and we used the term gross national happiness a lot. But it didn't really impress on me the importance of this concept until later on, when I got to know the king, because he was very accessible. He drove around most of the time in his Land Cruiser. He and the queens, you would see them a lot around town. But once I really understood this concept of gross national happiness and saw that it wasn't just a slogan, that it really did permeate the lives of Bhutanese, then I became much more interested in learning about it. You probably know that most countries are gauged by what is called gross national product. So gross national product is the measure of an output of a country and its citizens. It's an economic indicator. And in my line of work, that's how we measured much of the success of countries. If your GDP is rising, then you tend to be doing very well. If it's decreasing, then economically you tend not to be doing very well. Now that's a gross oversimplification, but at its very basic elements, that's what gross national product is. Gross national happiness is something much different. Let me tell you a little bit about gross national happiness. There were 9 elements that came together to form gross national happiness, as promulgated by the King of Bhutan. And this permeated their education system, it permeated their public service, it permeated their society. So what are those 9 elements? Well, the first was psychological well-being. The king wanted Bhutanese to have satisfaction in their life, to have positive emotions, to have spirituality. So psychological well-being was one of the major tenets of gross national happiness. Then there was health. He wanted them to have good mental health. He wanted there to be what he called healthy days in the country, where they learned about health, where there it was a focus on those who were the most vulnerable, who had infirmities or disabilities that need to be addressed. So health was another one of the major points of gross national happiness. Also, time use. He wanted there to be a balance between work and rest. He wanted Bhutanese to work hard, but also to play hard and to be well rested. Education was the fourth element of gross national happiness. He promoted literacy, schooling, increased knowledge, innovation. The fifth element was cultural diversity and resilience. He really wanted Bhutanese to connect with their culture and to develop especially their artistic skills and to participate in cultural events. The sixth element was good governance. The king believed very strongly in a government that was for the people. He was a king, so he had the overarching authority in the country. But I will say he was a benevolent king, and he believed in good governance and the fundamental rights of people and political participation, and I'll talk more about that later. The seventh element of gross national happiness was community vitality. He wanted there to be strong, well-governed communities that had services for families, where cities were livable and people could feel good about raising their families in not just in the capital city of Thimphu, but whether it was in Bhutan or Trongsa or any other Phuentsholing or any other city in Bhutan. The eighth element was ecological diversity and resilience. One of the reasons that the king at that time was so slow to open Bhutan up to the outside world, and especially to tourism, is that he desperately feared it becoming Nepal. In his mind, Nepal was the best argument against mass tourism because of the destruction of the environment, because of the trash and the over-tourism that had come to the country. He didn't want that. He wanted his small country to be ecologically diverse and to be as pristine as it could be. And this is a profoundly beautiful country. From the jungles in the south to the Himalayas in the north, it was fantastic, really. And he wanted to keep it that way. And finally, we get around to the economy. The ninth element of gross national happiness was living standards. He wanted to make sure that people were earning enough money, that they had good housing, that they had strong household incomes. So you might say, okay, this is what he wanted, but did he achieve it? Well, in some cases, he did. He certainly worked hard to achieve it. There were some detractors, both inside Bhutan and globally, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But he believed strongly in this. And by the way, his son, who is now the king, believes strongly in it as well. It's still very much a part of Bhutanese culture. What the king realized is in a country that small, it's very easy to lose yourself. It's very easy to lose your cultural heritage to become like everyone else. And he didn't want that. He considered Bhutanese culture to be unique, but also very fragile. And so he wanted to, as much as possible, protect that culture. Also, he wanted to, as much as possible, protect his people from outside influences, negative outside influences, like drugs and gangs and terrorist activities. These things that tend to erode quality of life and even destroy the fabric of countries. And there was definitely a reason why he wanted to ensure that at least the terrorism component was addressed, and that's because his father had been assassinated in Nairobi, Kenya, by those who sought to reconfigure the government of Bhutan. And so he was very cautious about opening the country up. And so he did it according to the principles of gross national happiness, but he also did it in a way that was slow and calculated. I remember the first time I heard him talk about this, it was obvious to me, as I said before, that it wasn't just a slogan. Because he went into meticulous detail about how he had thought through each one of these elements. And as I listened to what he was saying, it occurred to me that other countries would benefit from this as well. Why would any country reject the principles of gross national happiness as I outline them? I mean, think about it. Psychological well-being, health, use of time, education, cultural diversity, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity and resilience, and living standards. That's what any country would want, correct? If that's right, then why are so many countries, a huge majority of countries, primarily focused on gross national product instead of gross national happiness? I've worked in any number of countries where the gross national product has increased, but you couldn't see that overt effect on the people themselves. So you wondered if this gross national product was really creating prosperity. During my career, I came up with something called the prosperity paradox, and I won't go into detail because it's not important for this podcast and it would bore you to tears probably. But basically my premise was that countries look at the wrong things, they focus on the wrong things. That if you're just focused on looking good in the next World Bank report because your GDP grew, then you're very likely missing the fact that there's so many other elements to society that have to come together to really create prosperity. Because prosperity is more than economic growth. It's more than the money you have in your pocket. Prosperity is quality of life, it's education, it's health, it's all these things that are wrapped up in this element of gross national happiness. So here's this tiny country who has a king who strongly believes that his people should be happy and well and educated, should embrace gross national happiness. As I said, there were detractors. A good friend of mine who worked in Bhutan for a while would tell me ad nauseum, Mark, don't buy into this stuff. Man, it's smoke and mirrors. Because this country has an atrocious record on human rights. They've treated their non-Buddhist citizens very terribly. They've expelled them from the country, confiscated their homes. So all of this gross national happiness is simply a smoke and mirrors game to detract the world from looking at the fact that there are real problems in this country that aren't being solved. Well, I didn't personally witness anyone being expelled from the country or any human rights violations while I was there. I certainly witnessed them in many, many countries around the world, but not in Bhutan. So I can't speak to that. But what I can say is that there were some elements of gross national happiness that were more difficult to put in place than others. The education system there, from what I observed, was very good. Young people were educated, strong English skills. They were very much involved in the classical style of education. But there were those in the country that were extremely poor, that weren't living that lifestyle that the king hoped they would live, that weren't living, that didn't have that standard of living that one would expect under a principle like gross national happiness. But here's the strange thing about that. Yes, there were poor people. There were areas where the health system didn't meet the standards of what the king wanted for gross national happiness. There were some lapses in good governance on occasion. There was probably an over-focus on culture and some elements of culture that constricted the Bhutanese ability to integrate with the rest of the world. So I'm not saying that gross national happiness was perfect. But what I'm saying with all of this is, Bhutan is, I believe, the happiest place I ever worked. People were happy. Everywhere we would go, people had smiles on their face. They were pleased that we were there. Under gross national happiness, there was a rule, an unwritten rule in the country, that if one was traveling and they stopped in a village, they could go to a stranger's home and the stranger would feed them. They may not have much, but the community would come together and they would feed them. And there were many times when I was on the road in Bhutan, I would be with Dasho Sering Dorji, the head of the chamber, or Mr. Nadik, who I talked about in the last episode, who was on the board of the National Chamber, and we would come into a town, and people would just come out to greet us, and they would feed us and give us tea, and just about everyone in the town came out to welcome us. They were happy. So these detractors that say, well, gross national happiness doesn't work, there's still poor people, the hospitals still aren't up to standard, you've got these other problems, the standard of living is still not high enough. I believe that they're looking at it through one lens, when you had to look at gross national happiness through a number of lenses in order for it to really make sense. So to understand gross national happiness, or really just about anything about Bhutan, you really had to understand the king himself and his mindset. Now, the Bhutan had been a Buddhist kingdom for generations, but I want to talk about three of its kings today. Jimmy Dorji Wangchuck, who ruled Bhutan from 1952 to 1972, and who was assassinated in Nairobi, Kenya. This is the king, while I was there, Jimmy Singhi Wangchuck's father. So he was king for 20 years or so. And he began this slow movement toward the modernization of the country. The country was very much a Buddhist nation. It was the head of the Buddhist sect in Bhutan was extremely powerful, probably second only to the king. So they believed in Buddhism very much. But Jimmy Dorji Wangchuck began this movement toward some form of modernization. His son, Jimmy Singhi Wangchuck, became king in 1972 upon the assassination of his father. He was coronated 2 years later in 1974. And he is the person, as I said, who really began to promote this idea and develop this idea of gross national happiness and of modernization, if you will. But he wanted to take that modernization slow and steady. Another principle that he very much believed in, and by the time that I got there in the late 1990s, he was actively promoting, was the transition of the country from a full monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. It was almost a theocratic monarchy because of how steeped Buddhism was in that country. But he wanted to transition to a constitutional monarchy, which would reduce the powers of the monarch, leave the monarch in place, but reduce the powers of the monarch, and create a parliament, prime minister, etc., to operate under a constitution instead of just under the orders of a king. So you might ask, well, why would a king actively promote reducing his own powers? Well, you have to understand, Jimmy Singhi Wangchuck was educated primarily in the United Kingdom. So he was very much focused on and very much knowledgeable about the constitutional monarchy system that exists in the United Kingdom, where at that time Queen Elizabeth II was head of state and head of the church, but impaneled the parliament, if you will. The elected prime minister would come to her, ask to form a government. She would agree to form a government, and the government then would operate under the auspices of the prime minister and the parliament. Where the Queen's role in that constitutional monarchy in Britain, was more of a ceremonial role, but she still was head of state. This is the type of thing that he was promulgating for Bhutan as well. So you might think, okay, he's king, he can do what he wants. Just wave your hand, it's done. Well, there was a lot that he had to put in place in order to make this happen. And there was a lot of, I won't say a lot, there was a significant amount of pushback. The king was very much loved in Bhutan when I was there. He was respected. He and the Ashis, as I said, were visible around town, the four queens. His son, who later became king, was visible. And so it is, it was not something that everyone embraced immediately, this idea of a constitutional monarchy. But King Jimmy Singh Wangchuck strongly believed in it. And so as he began to promulgate this idea, he came to the conclusion that because of the powers that he had had before, if he continued as king, people would always look to him, and they wouldn't respect this new constitutional monarchy. And so he decided to abdicate. This happened after I had left Bhutan, because he abdicated in 2006. So he was king from 1972 until 2006. And he turned this country over to the crown prince, whose name is Jimmy Kesar Nangme Wangchuck. And Kesar continued to push this idea of a constitutional monarchy. And it is now, Bhutan is now a full constitutional monarchy. So the new king, Kesar, is the eldest son of Bhutan's fourth Druk Gyalpo, or king, Jimmy Singh Wangchuck, and his third wife, Queen Ashi Sering Yangdong. So when he took over in very different circumstances. Not very many kings abdicate. It happens, but that doesn't happen very often. And certainly that typically doesn't happen when there's also a quantum change in the type of government. So this new king, Kesar, took over at a time that I would say was somewhat challenging, because he's embracing this new governmental process and still trying to make his way as king. But he's navigated it, I think, very well. It's been several years since I've worked there or traveled there, but he seems to have navigated it very well. And he certainly, I think, followed the principles of gross national happiness and his father's wishes very much. Bhutan did open to tourism, but as I said in the previous episode, it's very tightly controlled. Pack in, pack out. You pay a certain fee. You get taken certain places. It's a very controlled environment. That doesn't work for every tourist. Some tourists want to do what they want to do. Well, that's fantastic. You can do that in probably 193, 194 countries in the world, but you're not going to do it in Bhutan. I actually support that because I've seen this country and how pristine it is, and believe that all that could be destroyed because I worked in Nepal as well, and King Jimmy Singhi Wangchuck had every reason to be concerned about Bhutan becoming Nepal. Nepal's a fascinating country, but it's over touristed, and it's created many, many problems. So, what does this tell us? Well, what it tells us is that leadership of a country means something. Leadership is the critical factor in the growth and success of countries. Here you had a king, a benevolent king. He didn't always do the right thing. Were some of these rumors of atrocities true? Quite possibly. Again, I never witnessed them, so I don't think it's appropriate for me to delve into that on this podcast. So he wasn't always right, but in the times that I interacted with him, and in my observation while I worked in the country, is that he tried to be fair. He really believed in what he was doing. He had a great love for his history and culture of his people. He would interact with the local population. He really tried to live out this philosophy, if you will, of gross national happiness. The work that I did there in helping to form a National Chamber of Commerce was part of this whole concept of gross national happiness, because he felt that it would create the momentum for increased business, for increased investment in a very strategic and careful way. Because he wanted investment to happen carefully as well, not just tourism, but he did not want to overwhelm the country with investors who just wanted to come in and make money and pillage the population. He wanted it done very strategically, and he felt that the best way to do that was by forming this National Chamber of Commerce, which is still successful to this day. I'm very glad that I had the chance to be at the foundational elements of that National Chamber of Commerce. I actually designed and conducted the first training program for those who would ultimately come in and run that National Chamber of Commerce. And they didn't know that much about what a National Chamber of Commerce did. And so I was able to work with them over a longer period of time to help them get started on the right foot. And it appears that happened because that chamber is still strong today. There's so much more that I could talk about relative to this little country. You know, I think back of the hikes that friends and I took in the Himalayas, and the picnics we had on mountainsides where you could just see beauty all around you, and the prayer flags that would fly over the city, and sitting at Swiss Bakery and having a sandwich with my friends, or sitting out with a Buddhist monk on a park bench near the traffic circle and watching these amazing traffic cops do their job, or playing basketball with the kids at the local junior high and high school, or going to an Indian fashion show in a country where you couldn't wear anything but national dress, sitting at the archery tournament on Saturday and watching the Bhutanese perform well in their native sport. All those days of traveling around the country in monsoon rains in the south in Funchling, over some of the scariest jungle roads that I've ever had the opportunity to travel on, to stopping at night along one of those jungle roads to get out and stretch our legs, and turning around and probably 25 to 30 yards away, a wild tiger and two cubs cross the road. This was as remote and disconnected a place as I've been, and there's so many great memories. Picking apples in Bhutan along with the locals. The first time I drank butter tea. You know what butter tea is? Well, I think probably the nearest you could come here in the United States is to take a stick of margarine, melt it, pour it in a cup with some milk, and drink it. That's what butter tea tasted like, and it was horrifying. But I was introduced to it there, and I drank it because that was culturally the right thing to do with the locals, even though it almost made me gag every time I did. All these memories flood back in every single country I've worked in, but I think they're more pronounced in Bhutan just because of the amazing nature of the people. And that really tied back to, at that time, this very visionary king who believed in this concept of gross national happiness and who did his best to take his country slowly and carefully and strategically into the future. I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to be part of that and travel and work in a country that most people couldn't even find, quite frankly, on a map. So, that's my final word on Bhutan. You should go there. Look it up online. Look up their tour packages. If you want a once-in-a-lifetime tour that will be planned perfectly from start to finish, this is your country. It is beautiful. It is pristine. It will leave a smile on your face when you leave, and you'll come away with not just beautiful photographs of nature. You'll come away with friends. You'll come away with great experiences. You'll come away with the stories of people who are amazing in their own right. Glad you joined me on some stops along the way today, and we'll see you next Monday, 8 a.m. We're going to start a new country under this new theme of airplanes and elephants, which encapsulates my work throughout South and Southeast Asia. Join us next time, Monday, 8 a.m., for some stops along the way. See you soon.